came across a story about a woman who received the skull of a Japanese soldier from her fiancé. Her boyfriend was simply fulfilling his promise to send her a Jap, as they said at the time. It turns out this wasn't unheard of among American soldiers, not universal but disturbingly common. As I wanted to know more about this phenomenon and dug deeper, an unpleasant truth revealed itself. In this video, I will show you what I found and share how I view it through the lens of my Central European background. First, I'll introduce you to the Imperial Japanese Army and its brutality. Then I will show you around the American wartime propaganda, including that weird school case. After that, I will discuss the internment of Japanese Americans. And at the end of the video, I will also reveal why the story is so disturbing for me. If you look up that lady with the skull, you will learn quickly that it traces back to the resentment against the Imperial Japanese Army. The IJA earned its infamous reputation for brutality through a systematic denial of human rights and disregard for the laws of war. Their concept of Bushido, or the warrior code, prioritized victory and death over surrender, leading them to view captured enemies, particularly Americans, as contemptible and less than human. This belief translated into horrific actions, including the widespread murder of captured soldiers, the systemic use of forced labor, or the infamous Bataan Death March. The march itself was characterized by severe cruelty, where exhausted prisoners were summarily executed if they fell, refused food for days, and were routinely beaten and bayoneted for seeking water or rest. Let's have a look at the testimony from the war crime trials. To avoid copyright issues, I used a paraphrase of the account. Soldiers who, due to physical exhaustion, sickness or battle injuries, were compelled to fall out of the line of march were summarily executed by guards utilizing bayonets or small arms fire, and their remains were often left unburied at the side of the road. Furthermore, the provision of basic necessities was willfully neglected. Prisoners were provided with little to no sustenance for multiple days, and any attempt to secure water or rest was met with immediate, unreserved violence from the escorting Imperial Army personnel. This was one of the countless other cases. In 1945, at the end of the war that Japan started with China in 1935, only 56 Chinese POWs were released by Japan. I let this information settle for a bit. 56. Historians suggest this extreme brutality stemmed from a toxic combination of factors. First, an ingrained racist ideology that considered Westerners and Chinese or other Asians racially inferior. Then, a military culture that mandated absolute obedience and rewarded cruelty. Aggression within the military was a norm. Compassion was seen as weakness. And then, a lack of logistical planning, which meant that commanders often choose to eliminate prisoners rather than allocate scarce resources to feed them. POWs starved to death practically. But the issue is even more complex than this. Terror was a government policy. The War Minister Hideki Tojo encouraged brutality against the enemy as a tactic of deterrence. And I have to mention the Bushido ideology. Surrender was seen as dishonorable. Bushido was an old military code, but in this era it was rediscovered and applied to the nationalist ideology. The psychology of the brutality is complex. Frank Jacob wrote a whole book on it, The Japanese War Crimes. The brutality of the IJA caused huge resentment in the United States. The public opinion about Japan was inherently a bit negative, but the sneak attack on Pearl Harbor sealed a growing hatred. This was amplified by the cruel methods of the Japanese army, and the US wartime propaganda was busy as well. Propaganda was critical because it served to racialize the enemy, ensuring that the hatred was directed not just at the enemy regime, but at the entire race. By portraying the Japanese as subhuman vermin, apes, or monstrous insects, the government made it psychologically easier for the American public and soldiers to support total unrestrained war and to rationalize horrific acts like trophy collecting as merely exterminating pests. The notorious case of the school sent to the fiancé was published in Life magazine and demonstrated the horrific reality of trophy collecting. A common practice in the Pacific, where American soldiers took ears, teeth, bones and skulls of dead Japanese soldiers. This was condemned by the US High Command in 1942, who mandated that no part of the enemy's body be removed for use as a souvenir. Yet the practice persisted. A bone carved into a letter opener was even controversially gifted to President Roosevelt. Among citizens, this wasn't universal, but disturbingly common. When I was reading about US propaganda, I came across the Tokyo Kid series. The posters are speaking for themselves. It was a passive-aggressive campaign where Japanese caricature the Tokyo Kid encouraged bad habits to help Japan win the war. The series utilized pre-existing societal contempt to bind antisocial behavior with Japanese pleasure. The messaging worked by implying that any setback or lack of effort on the home front, like wasting materials, skipping bond purchases, would directly benefit the Japanese, thereby leveraging existing public hatred and fear to enforce wartime discipline and participation. Honestly, I'm curious if it annoyed someone at that time. I mean, people are disappointing, but there is always someone who has second thoughts. What do you think? Okay, propaganda was one thing, but they locked up 120,000 Japanese Americans too as precaution. The military saw the Japanese Americans as liabilities. With today's standards, secret agents would address the problem, paying more attention to their community and their exchange with the homeland. But apparently, at that time, it was deemed acceptable to simply lock up the whole Japanese American community in the coastal area. But I will let to speak Milton S. Eisenhower, director of the War Relocation Authority himself.
When the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, our west coast became a potential combat zone. Living in that zone were more than 100,000 persons of Japanese ancestry. We knew that some among them were potentially dangerous. First attention was given to the problems of sabotage and espionage. Nearby San Pedro, houses and hotels occupied almost exclusively by Japanese were within a stone's throw of a naval air base, shipyards, oil wells. Japanese fishermen had every opportunity to watch the movement of our ships.
The process began with Executive Order 9066 in February 1942, which, in neutral language, granted the military commanders the authority to designate military zones and restrict the movement of any person within them.
So as a first step, all Japanese were required to move from critical areas such as these. All persons of Japanese descent were required to register, and the Japanese themselves cheerfully handled the enormous paperwork involved in the migration. They helped the evacuees find tenants for their farms. They helped businessmen lease, sell, or store their property. But quick disposal of property often involved financial sacrifice for the evacuees.
This power was instantly and exclusively used to force the removal of over 120,000 people of Japanese ancestry, 2/3 of whom were US citizens.
Naturally, the newcomers looked about with some curiosity. They were in a new area. Immediately wanted to go to work. At Manzanar, they built a lath house and began rooting guayuli cuttings.
Families were given only days to dispose of their property, and they were first sent to temporary assembly centers.
The evacuees cooperated wholeheartedly. Santa Anita Racetrack, for example, suddenly became a community of about 17,000 persons. The Army provided housing and plenty of healthful, nourishing food for all.
This makeup was too successful. Los Angeles Times in 1942, regarding the movie, argued that the Japanese in the centers had been afforded the very best of treatment, far better than many of them ever knew before. Awkward.
Meanwhile, in Arizona, Utah, Colorado, Wyoming, and elsewhere, quarters were being built where they would have an opportunity to work and more space in which to live.
Before being shipped by sealed trains to 10 permanent relocation centers in desolate inland locations. You know, this whole thing is just... I know this story from somewhere else.
In the meantime, we are setting a standard for the rest of the world in the treatment of people who may have loyalties to an enemy nation. We are protecting ourselves without violating the principles of Christian decency.
The internment was justified by military leaders and the government as a matter of military necessity to prevent espionage and sabotage. They argued that because no sabotage had yet occurred, it was proof that a coordinated large-scale attack was being planned. Like, what? This justification was later upheld by the Supreme Court in the Korematsu case, prioritizing perceived national security and war hysteria over constitutional rights, an action the US government later formally apologized for. You see, my home country allied with the Axis powers and killed Jewish civilians. They framed Jewish people as security threat, an enemy within, to justify their persecution, and yes, the ultimate goal was far more horrific. I learned about that in detail, and I believe all of us are relieved that the Allied forces ultimately beat the Axis. That's a good thing. This fact felt like restoration of normality. In Eastern and Central Europe, the story goes on with the Soviet invasion, interments, and then the installments of Soviet puppet governments. What happened there was insane, I'm telling you. I studied history and geography, global history as well, so my surprise is a bit awkward, but yes, I was thinking the rest of the world was more sane. But they weren't. I looked it up and I found the UK, Australia and Canada also imprisoned groups of their civilians based on their origins during the war. With the same justification, security threat. How much worse is this compared to a narrative where the glorious Allied nations simply put an end to the injustice of the Axis? I mean, they're supposed to be the good guys, no? Anyway, I will create further videos about my journey in history. Subscribe to stay tuned for more, and thanks for watching.